I'm going to tell you about is you may have seen me digging around through boxes at the end of the hall, which, by the way, are now blocked by equipment, so I can't even get at them. But anyway, you're probably wondering what I'm doing over there, and so I mean to tell you about that. I am looking through the archives of a now defunct society called the Society of Wireless Pioneers. And this society was founded by this gentleman. His name was Bill Brenneman. He had been a ship radiotelegrapher in World War I. After that, he moved to aero radio, and he worked with an agency that eventually became the FAA in setting up their communications from various airports to planes. So he had a lot of communications experience. He knew a lot of people, and he eventually moved to Northern California here, and in 1968 founded the Society of Wireless Pioneers, which was an organization that was really for, he called it professional brass pounders. So these were the guys that were on mostly ships. About 95% of them had been on ships at various times. And they were the ones that were the radio officers. Some of them had worked in ground stations or on airplanes, but most were ships. And they, what they did is they wanted to, there were so many of them in the Sonoma County area that it was quite easy to found an organization where these guys could get together and talk about the old days. So they had two purposes. One was to, if you were a professional like this, you could get together. They had chapters US-wide and even out of the United States, there were a couple. And eventually what happened was as they got older and older and there were no more radio officers, right? And their membership started to decline. They eventually had over 5,000 members. They turned more into an educational organization trying to preserve the history of early communications. So they were able to collect materials from their members that we now have down the hall. These are photographs, they're letters, they're diaries, they're memoirs, they're documents, there's schematics, there's catalogs, there's calendars, there's drawings, there's everything you can imagine in there. And a lot of the photographs are of interest. This is a guy named Marlo Abernathy, and I call him the king of the scrapbookers because he made thousands of photographs and put them in books, well annotated so we knew what they were. He was in the Navy. He was a captain eventually, and he was allowed access apparently to these early, mostly US Navy stations like Mare Island. He took lots of pictures. He marked them up well, and wouldn't you love to have that vehicle, that RDF vehicle parked right here in Alameda? That would be something. So what can you find in these archives from people like him? Well, here's one of his pictures in a scrapbook, and you could tell it's his because he pastes them on this dark blue cardboard and writes what they are underneath. Here's a station that's local. It's in Napa, and it's 1923, and he's got, you probably can't read it from there, but he's marked it up with CW 200 meters and phone 200 meters. The phone 200 meters is actually a phone. You know, it's the old, from a candlestick phone, the microphone. But what I also noticed is that the receiver there is one that I've seen before, not in person, but on pictures of. It's a DeForest inner panel. The idea being it was modular. You could put in another amplifier section if you wanted. You could switch something out if they improved it. And you don't see many of those around. This guy had one. Speaking of DeForest, here he is. It's a nicer picture than you saw before. It's before all his hair fell off, right? This is the world's only print we know of this particular portrait of DeForest, which we've scanned here from when he was 37 years old. And if you have questions about him, talk to Mike. Now, another even more interesting thing, along with some of these people had worked with Lee DeForest. There were DeForest pioneers in the organization. And so one of the historians for the Society of Wireless Pioneers was this guy, Henry Dicka, who also did things like founded the San Francisco Radio Club, right? A very early amateur organization here. He managed to get this book from the DeForest company. And it was kind of strange because two things. It was professional photographs of DeForest equipment, but the equipment was like scratched, had fingerprints on it. And it's like, why do you pay a New York photographer to make, you know, photographs of stuff that, why doesn't he clean it off or something? Well, Bart came up with the answer to that. It was actually sent to an artist who would then redraw it, and of course he wouldn't draw the scratches. So that was strange, but the other thing was it contained things that had never been seen before. At least we had never seen them before. for example, this. It's pretty bizarre. It's like, it looks like a coffin on wheels or something, right? Obviously, it has something to do with radio. You see a speaker there. Well, Bart actually put this together with an old book on telegraphy, and it turns out that he's identified this as a portable spark radio telephone. So you're going to talk into the microphone. There's a quenched gap there with the fan blowing air through it, and you're going to get you're going to be transmitting over a spark. You're modulating a spark, which is, it must have sounded really wonderful fidelity, right? So yeah, this is the kind of thing we've run across over there. Obviously, this was around World War I, and he wanted to sell this to the military, right? That would have been his big market. It had been thought of before, and here's another early inventor in the Bay Area. His name was Francis J. McCarty. He's really young. In fact, he didn't live very long. He died in a carriage accident in Oakland shortly after the San Francisco earthquake. Now, he was from a big family. He had a dozen kids, Irish family in the city, right? And he decided that he was going to support the family, and the way he was going to do this was to become an inventor and start making the radio telephony stations, which must have thrilled his mother, right? Sounds like a very practical way to go in those days, right? But actually he did it. He was responsible for the very first voice transmission, I believe, in the western US. Originally across Stowe Lake in San Francisco, which is now Golden Gate Park. You can see a schematic for his voice transmission system. It's pretty primitive. There's not even a capacitor or resistor, right? Much less an audion or anything. You're directly modulating a spark with basically, again, a telephone microphone, and you're picking it up on a mercury coherer. It's kind of amazing that could work, but apparently it did. And he got enough financial backing through his uncle, who was well known in San Francisco bars apparently, and was able to raise money that way. Called Uncle White Hat because he wore a white beaver hat. And Uncle White Hat got him enough so that they actually got a real company going, and they put up a station in the Sunset District, which was the first wireless phone station in the western United States. And this was in, what, 1905 or thereabouts. At the time, it was all dunes. It wasn't like houses like you see now. It was sand, and they would have to keep a shovel around the door of that shack because they would get, if you wanted to get in or out, the sand would have piled up on you. So interesting history there. Now, Francis died young, but he had a brother. One of his brothers is Ignatius. He's shown on the left here, and Ignatius has another interesting story. He was part of the company as well, and he learned about radios and electronics. And he used it a different way after the company eventually folded. So he was a real, genuine, hard-boiled San Francisco 1930s detective. Oh, that shows up kind of interestingly there. Anyway, yeah, his specialty was bugging. So he learned from his brother and from the company that you could make these really small microphones, right? And you could sneak into somebody's office or their house, and you could put them in some inconspicuous place, originally with a wire, a very thin wire, and then you could use it for law enforcement, right? So here he is with an INS agent, and they are supposedly busting up a human smuggling ring that's bringing Chinese women into San Francisco. There's a million interesting stories that you'll get through the archives there. We also have a bunch of radio equipment pictures and catalogs. Here's one. This is an Electro importing company, that Gernsbach's company in New York, although it was sold through a place on Market Street, Paul Saylor Electric Works. Here's one of their ads were probably written by Hugo himself, I'm suspecting, or his brother, or whoever worked there. But for example, look at the ad for the Leyden jar, right? That was your capacitor of the day. Our jars embody the best workmanship. And I don't know if you can see it at the bottom, but what it says towards the end is, it is powerful enough to kill a cat with a single discharge. So, Hugo, that's great, and unlike the inferior ones where you have to use 2 or 3, right? But we don't know how if he ever actually tested that, unfortunately. Here's the very first RCA home radio pamphlet from the early 1920s. And what struck me about it, well, we know what's behind the panel on those things. It's mostly coils, right, and a few rheostats. It was selling for $263, which was about the price of a new Model T in the day. So if their slogan is correct, there's a radiola for every purse. You had to have quite a purse in order to get this radiola. And it's doubtful that they sold too many of those, although it was the early 20s before the Depression. So we see a lot of things in the archives. There's a lot of military stuff. Many of the members had been in the US Navy. A few of them had been in the Army Signal Corps. It amazes me how young some of the soldiers and sailors are in these pictures. If you look at the kids on the right here, this is France, 1918. Probably in a training thing. There's no action going on, and they're out in the open. So, but still, it's France, 1918. Those kids are what, maybe 17 years old or something. This is, you know, that's what military is about. And if you ever see that particular radio that they're using, please don't put it in the flea market, right? Not only young people, but older people too. This is Henry McCandless in the middle there. Now, Henry's the guy that did the first Audion bulbs. It blew the bulbs for DeForest. He worked with DeForest. He went on to manufacture early tube bulbs. And he had quite an operation going for a while. And the guy next to him is Gerald Tyne, who you may recognize the name. He wrote a book about, was it the saga of the vacuum tube? Yeah. And then you see some unexpected stuff in the archives. Now, this isn't from the archives. This is from my wife Jan's family photo album. The guy on the left is her great uncle. His name was Johnny Waters. He lived in Santa Ana around, early 1900s. And that's the woman next to him. He would eventually marry, and they would live for many years together. But we knew from this picture he was into radio, and we looked it up, and I looked it up and found, with Bart's help, that he also was a ham, and he was 6QW, which was one of the earliest stations in Orange County. So we knew that, and we also heard that he had been in the Navy. In World War II, he was a captain of a ship, apparently, and then he retired. But what we didn't know is he was also a Society of Wireless Pioneers member, and I totally randomly ran across one of his letters in there, which told a story that I'm going to write up. It's about how he barely escaped death at one point. So all kinds of things, all kinds of stories. The guy on the left here is George Hubbard. He was a real ladies' man, as you could sort of tell from this picture. And I can tell you more about that if you ask me personally. And we'll see George again. But on the right, another interesting figure is Arthur Enderlin. Now, he grew up in a very poor family, and he wasn't able to go to high school. He had to go to work as soon as he was out of 8th grade, which was not that unusual in those days. But he was a very intelligent guy, and he had a profound abilities for languages, for chess, for puzzles, for codes, for ciphers. He taught himself basically radio electronics at the time, which was a fairly new field. He became a radiotelegrapher and eventually ended up with the Navy. Again, he also became eventually a captain of a ship, I believe, in World War II. But the interesting thing about him is when he was retired after that, he was asked by the Defense Department to set up a worldwide communication system for an organization that subsequently became known as the National Security Agency. So this is the guy that set up the first NSA communications, and he was in charge of that for 10 years in the 1950s. We wouldn't have known that from the archives, but his daughter got in touch with us because she saw it on the website. He has thousands of photos of early radio equipment she's trying to find a home for. This is a big deal, was to put up, to transmit from and communicate from the mainland US to Hawaii. That was a big goal for some of the early radio people. This is 1906, February 1906, and these guys were the ones that thought they were going to do it. It's a Pacific Wireless company, right? And they're going to put up a transmitter and receiver on Mount Tam in 1906, and they're going to put up another station in Hawaii and get them to talk to each other by spark in those days. We have another picture here. This is the same guys, and somebody's written Honolulu or bust on it. Well, it turned out to be bust, right? It didn't work, and there's several stories as to what happened to that station that Bart will be happy to tell you about. Very interesting stuff. But the company did manage to, if not to communicate from California to Hawaii, they communicated to Catalina Island. So in 1903, they put up Station A. That was the call sign, Dida, right? Pretty cool. They put up Station A in Avalon, and there was another station in Los Angeles, and they were supposedly the first profitable radio telegraphy in the western United States. And many of you, probably everybody here, has flown out of Oakland Airport at some point, right? Well, you ever notice Hagenberger Road? There's another one called Maitland Road in the area. Well, the guy on the right is Hagenberger, and the guy on the left is Maitland. And the reason the roads are named after them is they did the first flight from Oakland to Hawaii, flying from Oakland to Oahu, I believe, in 1927. Their plane is called the Bird of Paradise, and if you go to the Oakland Airport Museum, they still have the prop from it and a lot of pictures of that. So what does this have to do with the Society of Wireless Pioneers, and why do they have these photos there? Well, these guys would fly over shipping lanes. If you're doing a dangerous overwater flight, and you at least wanted somebody to be able to pick you up if you had to crash into the water and if you managed to get out of that. So they flew over shipping lanes. Another reason for doing that was maybe you'd find a ship that could tell you exactly where you were, because it was very hard to fix a position from a moving plane at the time. Question?
Most of these are flying boats, though, weren't they? So
no, this one wasn't. This was a land plane. Yeah, they wanted to fly.
Flying boats.
Yeah, they had flying boats, but this was the first completely over water flight in a land plane. So they were dead if they hit the water. I mean, if they could get out, they'd be lucky to get out, and then, you know, they'd be real lucky for somebody to pick them up. So it's quite an accomplishment, and that's why they named the streets after these guys. But they did make contact with one ship along the way. That was the SS President Cleveland, and this guy, his name is Fred Manglesdorf, was a society member many years later. This picture is actually taken a few years before, and you notice that this barrel in the background, this is an arc transmitter. When you see that, that's arc. One of the big problems with it was it actually had to use an atmosphere of ethyl alcohol, right? This is 1920s, and you had to have ethanol feeding that thing, and somehow on those ships at sea, that ethanol would go missing all the time. So it was a mystery they never solved as to why that ethanol never lasts. But Fred made contact with these flyers on their way to Hawaii. He got a thank you note from them. He did kind of grumble to the other society members. He said, I could have given them a fix in their position if they just did what I told them to do, but they didn't get back to me in time. And they found Hawaii anyway, so it didn't matter, Fred. Okay. Here's another adventure. George Hubbard, the guy we talked about earlier, he was the radio officer on the SS Asia, and this is one of the many SOS stories you'll get through the archives. There's probably at least a couple hundred of them. Hubbard was awoken at 5:30 in the morning by the ship hitting the rocks. He was a great writer and a humorist, actually. He had a great account of this, and you'll find it on the Society website. I won't even attempt to tell you what it was. I couldn't do justice. But the passengers and crew here, and this is a photograph I think he took, they're watching as the ship is actually starting to go under. And what's happening is you can barely see, there's little long boats along the side there. Those are Chinese river pirates that are coming to try to take whatever they could before the ship went under. So interesting times, right? Here's a guy who you may have heard of or not. His name was Ralph Mathews, and he was an amateur. He was part of the ARRL system that was transmitting relay messages for the first time between the coasts, right, and back. He was the district manager, District 9 Chicago. But you may also notice his station here, which you're seeing the receiving end of, is 9ZN. Well, he was a co-founder of Zenith Radio, and Zenith got its name from that station, 9ZN. Ralph worked for Zenith for some years, then he went to other companies. He eventually retired to Mexico. And when he was in Mexico and he was reading something from AARP, of all places, they talked about the Society of Wireless Pioneers. So he wrote him a letter and said, hey, can I join? And they said, were you a radio telegrapher? And he said, yeah. So he became a member. He sent all these, we have all these photos that he sent and his biography and letters and things you're not going to find elsewhere. One of the photos is this. So for Zenith in its early days, they had a portable transmitter. When it was a novelty, the commander that was running Zenith knew how to get publicity, right? He was a master of that. So he had this portable transmitter that was mounted on a truck, and they drove this old truck all over. They went to the East Coast, they interviewed Jack Dempsey. They drove to Pikes Peak, they transmitted from Pikes Peak. They went across the desert in Arizona, you know, between the cactuses. And here they are in Southern California. And that lion on the left is the MGM lion. So when you see those MGM movies with the lion roaring at the front, that's him, or at least one of them. There may have been more than one. And he's got a carbon microphone in front of him, and Mathews, by his own admission, is thinking of, how do I get out of here in time? Okay, and this is a little bit tamer, but hey, this brings in something that we heard about today, because this is KFRC in San Francisco. It was never an NBC affiliate, as far as I know, but there on the desk are chimes. So I don't know if you can tell me, John, what they were using their chimes for.
Same thing?
Yeah, same thing. I guess many stations must have had those. Huh?
Yeah.
So the nice thing about some of these pictures is they're so detailed you can blow them up and actually read the writing on the consoles there. This one's from Western Electric, and I think that's a Western Electric speaker on top, cone speaker. So this is sometime in the 1920s, to judge by the carbon microphone. This is what the typical ship rig looked like in the early days. And you've got your 1-inch spark gap and the transformer that feeds it. But I don't know how many people know the thing on the upper left below the porthole. Does anybody know what that is? Huh? We'll take a quiz. Yeah, you're right. It's a Marconi magnetic detector. They call them Maggies. And the way that would work, Marconi, I think, did not have patent rights to crystals for a while. So what they did is Marconi invented this, which had a hand crank on it. So you had to crank it up. It was like a Victrola motor, and it would turn the metal wire between those two reels. And those would pass through a magnetic field and through a coil, and the coil would pick up the signal if you were lucky. So yeah, that's pretty vintage stuff. I don't think we've ever seen one here at C.H.R.S. yet, have we? Another, a slightly larger and probably a little more modern station. This came from Ralph Mathews' photos, so he was probably on one of the ships that he was on. This says U.S. Navy Oscillion transmitter, and so I'm imagining that must be DeForest. Because he had the Audion and the Oscillion and all that. You can see a spherical Audion there, the usual microphone, and then he's got the two, these must be the transmitting tubes, and he's got a fan blowing over them, and I think there's actually a vent for the hot air over there, which I could probably use too, right? Another member of the society was this guy, Hedley Morris, and he also started with the Navy as a radiotelegrapher. He got to be a chief engineer for KPH at some point, and he went around taking photos of the massive equipment at Bolinas, among other places. He's got a lot more of Kahuku in Hawaii, which I have to scan and post yet. But this is Bolinas. It was a spark station, so you're talking 1920. They're sending things out with, I think it was 200 kilowatts of spark. Can you imagine the tons of ozone that they're putting into the atmosphere, right? But he has annotated this, and so you can see that you turn this wheel and it aligns the field poles so that you've synchronized your rotary spark gap, which is on the other side of the wall. It's like, well, I'm glad he wrote that, because I would always be wondering what that was for, right? We're coming near the end here. I just wanted to say, why does this stuff matter? Well, it's radio history. It's not usually appreciated, because you think of radio history and you think of the kind of sets we have here in broadcasting, which was a big part of it. You think about amateurs and their contribution, which was also a big part. But there was also a huge advancements made because of the ship-to-shore and point-to-point communications that Marconi started out wanting to do. So this is an underappreciated area of history exploration. Also gets you into US and world history. Pretty cool stuff. I'm very much obliged to C.H.R.S. for taking this on, and also especially to Bart. And to Mike and all the others that were involved in bringing the archives over. They look like a bunch of old boxes, but there's treasure inside of them. My friend Phil has been fixing up a lot of the photos to take out scratches and things. Does a very professional job. My wife is supporting me, which is really nice, because I don't think I could do it otherwise. This is all because of those men and women that went before, and thank you for your attention. And finally, here's a genuine radiogram. So pretend it's Christmas 1928, 90 years ago. Hearty Christmas greetings and best wishes for happiness in the new year. Okay, thank you.